The studio lights were hot, almost punishing in their glare. Chris Wallace leaned forward, his expression sharpened into a smirk that carried decades of broadcast authority. He had asked the kind of question designed not to illuminate but to corner, to rattle, to expose weakness. The audience watching from their homes leaned in, sensing the pressure, waiting for Jasmine Crockett to stumble. But instead, something remarkable happened. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She didn't fight fire with fire. She answered with a calm precision so devastating that the smirk on Wallace's face collapsed into silence. For a full second, the studio froze. The cameras kept rolling, the lights kept burning, but the air was thick with something rare in American politics. Dignity that cut sharper than any insult. It was a silence that spoke volumes. Silence that revealed Wallace's push had met not with fear, but with composure. And that composure, unshaken and unwavering, turned the studio into a stage where arrogance withered in real time. Viewers felt it through their screens. The shift, the inversion of power. This was not the politician being grilled. This was the interviewer losing control of his own performance. Every debate has a heartbeat, a moment when one side seizes control and the other begins to unravel. In that silence, Crockett took the heartbeat in her hands. She reminded millions that sometimes the strongest blow is not shouted, but spoken softly, leaving the other side with no weapon left to draw. The audience at home knew they had just witnessed something they would replay, share, and argue about for days. But this wasn't only about two people under the lights. This was about what it meant for a new generation of leaders to stand calm and unbroken against the machinery of old media provocation. Crockett didn't just answer Wallace. She answered the cynicism that so often poisons public life. She became, in that instant, a vessel for something larger. The idea that truth, delivered with composure, still carries weight in a world addicted to spectacle. The silence lingered like thunder after lightning, yet it was only the opening act. Because what happened next would not just freeze a studio, it would ignite a national conversation that Wallace never intended and Crockett never feared. The silence in that studio was not an empty pause. It was electric. Millions of eyes were glued to their screens, streaming networks, and social feeds, watching the moment in real time. This wasn't some off-air exchange tucked away in the archives of political interviews. This was live television, and live television has no mercy. Every second of hesitation, every flicker of emotion, every shift in body language was broadcast directly into the living rooms of America. And in those living rooms, people sat forward, sensing that something extraordinary had just unfolded. Chris Wallace had built his career on moments like these. For decades, his reputation had been ironclad. The tough, unflinching interviewer who could rattle presidents, foreign leaders, and senators alike. His style was calculated: press hard, push boundaries, corner the guest until they cracked under. Pressure. Viewers tuned in not for balance, but for the thrill of watching the mighty squirm under his relentless gaze. Wallace's smirk wasn't accidental. It was the weapon of a man who believed he could always control the game. But Jasmine Crockett was not a guest like the others he had faced. She didn't come from the polished halls of establishment politics where media training taught officials to dodge and deflect. Her reputation was forged in the heat of real struggle, fearless, unapologetic, unwilling to play by the old rules. Crockett had made her name by breaking molds, by saying the things others swallowed, by carrying herself with a dignity that refused to bend even when under siege. She didn't need to match Wallace's aggression with more aggression. She needed only to be herself, and that was precisely what made this clash so riveting. For Wallace, credibility was on the line. Could he maintain his status as the great interrogator? For Crockett, the stakes were even higher. This wasn't just about her political brand. It was about identity, about dignity, about proving that calm resolve could still triumph in a world where shouting often drowns out truth. If she faltered, critics would claim she wasn't ready, that she couldn't withstand the glare of national scrutiny. But if she stood her ground, if she turned Wallace's push into her own platform, then she wouldn't just survive the moment, she would define it, and America was hungry for definition. In a time when politics often feels like theatre stripped of meaning, viewers crave authenticity, crave those moments when the mask drops and the truth peeks through. Crockett's calm answer was more than a rebuttal. It was a declaration that authenticity still mattered. That identity and dignity weren't weaknesses to be mocked, but sources of undeniable strength. Even as the silence lingered, phones were already lighting up. Clips being snipped, uploaded, shared within seconds. The velocity of the internet meant that by the time Wallace cleared his throat, hashtags were already forming. Viewers didn't just watch, they reacted, they amplified, they made the moment bigger than the studio itself. America didn't know it yet, but this was about to become the clip of the week, the kind of exchange that outlives the news cycle, that gets replayed in classrooms, in living rooms, in campaign ads. Wallace had wanted a stumble. Instead, he sparked a cultural flashpoint. And as the segment moved forward, the question hanging in the air was no longer whether Crockett could withstand the pressure. It was whether Wallace himself could withstand what was coming next. Chris Wallace was no stranger to the bright lights. For decades, he had been a fixture on American television screens, his voice and presence carrying the weight of broadcast tradition. He wasn't the flashy anchor shouting slogans from behind a desk, nor the caricatured pundit whipping up partisan frenzy. Wallace's power came from something subtler, the cold precision of a man who could ask a question like a dagger, slicing through rehearsed talking points and forcing even presidents to shift uncomfortably in their chairs. That reputation, respected, feared, and in some corners resented, made him the kind of journalist who seemed untouchable. He was the son of media royalty, raised in the shadow of Mike Wallace, whose legendary toughness had defined an era of television journalism. Chris inherited not just the platform, but the persona, the unrelenting interviewer who projected fairness while often pressing with an unmistakable edge. And yet, over the years, a narrative had grown around him. For all his claims of neutrality, critics saw bias seep into the seams. The questions weren't always balanced, the framing not always neutral. To many, Wallace represented the old guard of media, one that claimed objectivity while subtly enforcing the same hierarchies of power it pretended to interrogate. It was this contradiction that became his trademark. On the one hand, Wallace was lauded for his sharpness, the rare journalist who could hold both Republicans and Democrats to account. On the other, he was accused of wielding his authority unevenly, coming down harder on those who represented change, on those who rattled the comfortable status quo. He insisted he treated all voices equally, but his tone, his body language, his phrasing betrayed something else, a skepticism reserved for outsiders, newcomers, disruptors. And that skepticism was on full display with Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't a figure molded by establishment expectations, and Wallace knew it. The smirk he carried into their exchange wasn't just about the question. It was about what he thought she represented: youth, defiance, and the audacity to stand tall in a space long dominated by men with deeper pedigrees and safer postures. His approach to Crockett was laced with subtle condescension, the way a veteran looks at a rookie stepping onto the court, certain the kid isn't ready for prime time. Wallace's style thrived on imbalance. He would set the stage with a question, framed so tightly that any answer seemed like a trap. To an untrained eye, it looked like hard journalism. To those paying closer attention, it was a performance, one where Wallace played the arbiter of truth and his guests were reduced to scrambling for air. He had done it countless times before, and it had worked. Senators, governors, even presidents had walked away bruised, their soundbites carefully crafted into his narrative. But the contradictions were piling up. For every moment of brilliance, there was another where his questions seemed loaded, his neutrality shading into something sharper. He insisted he was not partisan, yet his sharpest arrows always seemed aimed at those pushing cultural or generational change. The establishment could spar with him, understanding the rules of his game. But for new voices, especially those from marginalized communities, his tone shifted into something harsher, something dripping with the quiet arrogance of gatekeeping. It was the gatekeeper role he relished most. Wallace was the keeper of credibility, the man whose approval could elevate or whose disdain could diminish. But that role, once unquestioned, was beginning to crack. The media landscape was changing. No longer did the gatekeepers decide the narrative alone. Social media, grassroots movements, and a hunger for authenticity were eroding the monopoly of figures like him. Still, Wallace leaned into his craft, certain that his mastery of the old rules would always keep him ahead of the curve. And that was why the moment with Jasmine Crockett mattered so much. He approached it like every other confrontation, certain that his carefully sharpened question would leave her scrambling, that his smirk would be the punctuation mark of victory. But Crockett was not a guest from the old playbook. She didn't fit neatly into his traps. Her calm, her poise, her refusal to flinch rendered his dagger dull. The silence that followed wasn't just about her answer, it was about his unraveling. For the first time in a long time, Chris Wallace looked not like the master of the stage, but like a man caught in his own performance. The mask of control slipped, and the audience at home saw it. The contradiction he had carried for years, neutrality claimed, bias revealed, suddenly came into sharper focus. He had pushed, and for once, the push had not landed. But on this day, his trademark interrogation would backfire. And the fallout from that backfire would echo far beyond the walls of the studio, setting off a chain reaction that Wallace himself could never have predicted. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive on that stage by accident. Her presence across from Chris Wallace was the product of a journey marked not by privilege, but by perseverance, not by shortcuts, but by relentless determination. To understand why her calm answer carried such weight, one has to understand where that composure was born. Crockett grew up in a world that often underestimated her before she even opened her mouth. A black woman from the South, she carried the weight of stereotypes pressed against her shoulders. Stereotypes that told her she should know her place, that her voice should remain on the margins. But she refused to be confined. Education became her weapon, advocacy her shield. Before stepping into politics, she carved her path as a lawyer, representing those whose voices were too easily silenced, standing in courtrooms where power was, stacked against the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. That fight was never glamorous, and it was rarely easy. Crockett's days were spent listening to stories of people broken by systems that were supposed to protect them, watching justice twist into something unrecognizable. And in those long hours, she forged her armor, not the kind made of steel, but the kind made of conviction. When doors slammed in her face, when colleagues dismissed her as too young or too loud, she learned the art of persistence. She learned that dignity, carried consistently, can outlast arrogance every single time. When she transitioned into politics, Crockett did not reinvent herself to fit the mold of polished insiders. She brought her unapologetic fire with her, the same fire that had carried her through courtrooms and community meetings. She wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy, even if it meant standing alone. She wasn't afraid to demand that institutions listen, even when those institutions were designed to ignore. Her style was direct, her tone fearless, and her presence impossible to dismiss. Supporters found her refreshing, a break from the carefully rehearsed politicians who spoke in circles but said nothing. Critics, on the other hand, branded her as abrasive, unfiltered, too bold. But what her critics called too much, her supporters called courage. That courage came at a cost. Crockett endured the constant barrage of dismissiveness, colleagues interrupting her mid-sentence, commentators reducing her to stereotypes, opponents painting her passion as anger. The double standards were relentless. Where men were praised for being tough, she was accused of being hostile. Where others were applauded for boldness, she was told to be quiet. But every insult, every attempt to diminish her, only sharpened her resolve. She learned that her authenticity was not a weakness, but her greatest strength, and that the very qualities that made her an outsider to the establishment made her indispensable to those she represented. Her rise in politics was not about titles or accolades. It was about representation. Crockett became a voice for those who saw themselves shut out of the corridors of power. Immigrants, women of color, working-class families, they recognized in her a reflection of their own battles. She spoke not as someone looking down from a podium, but as someone who had walked in their shoes. That relatability, raw and unpolished, made her dangerous to the establishment. She was proof that leadership could look different, sound different, and still command respect. By the time she sat across from Wallace, Crockett had built a reputation that preceded her. Her speeches went viral, not because they were rehearsed, but because they were real. Her interviews captured attention, not because she followed the script, but because she tore the script apart. She had become the kind of politician who refused to shrink herself to make others comfortable. And that refusal carried with it a magnetic pull for those who had been waiting to see someone stand tall in spaces designed to keep them small. Still, the weight of representation is heavy. Crockett knew that every time she walked into a studio, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every woman who had been told to stay quiet, every immigrant who had been told to wait their turn, every young person who had been told they weren't ready. She carried them with her, and that responsibility could have been crushing. But for Crockett, it was fuel. And so, when Wallace leaned in with his trademark smirk, when he sharpened his question into a blade meant to cut, he wasn't facing just Jasmine Crockett the politician. He was facing Jasmine Crockett the fighter, the advocate, the woman who had turned struggle into strength. He was facing someone who had weathered far worse than the pointed words of a television host, someone who knew that true power is not measured in volume, but in composure. Her calm in that moment was not an act. It was the culmination of years of being underestimated and proving people wrong. It was the poise of someone who had fought for dignity in courtrooms, in legislatures, in communities where people's lives hung in the balance. That calm was fire forged through struggle, tempered into steel. It was this very fire, forged in struggle, that prepared her for what Wallace hurled next. And the world watching would soon discover just how powerful that fire could be. Chris, Wallace leaned in further, as though proximity itself could amplify the weight of his words. His voice tightened, carrying the authority of a man who had spent decades crafting pointed questions designed to make even the most seasoned politicians stumble. This was no softball. It was a question framed with surgical precision, meant to corner Jasmine Crockett into either contradiction or surrender. The air grew heavier as his words hung in the studio, a challenge, a trap, a gauntlet thrown at her feet. The studio audience, small but present, shifted in their seats, Even through the lens of the cameras, millions at home could feel the tension rise. This was the kind of moment Wallace thrived on. The ambush, the pinning of his guest against the wall of logic, daring them to fight their way out. He punctuated his question with that infamous smirk, the one that suggested he already knew the outcome, the one that told viewers he had the upper hand. But Jasmine Crockett didn't take the bait. Her body language told a different story. She didn't lean back in retreat, nor did she lean forward in aggression. She sat upright, shoulders squared, her face serene. There was no flicker of panic, no sign of fluster. Her composure itself became a quiet rebuke to the provocation. To the audience, it was almost unsettling, because everyone expected the firebrand, the flash of temper, the spark that Wallace could seize upon to declare victory. She gave him nothing. Instead, Crockett's stillness commanded the room. Her calmness contrasted so sharply with Wallace's pressing tone that it flipped the power dynamic. He was the one straining, reaching, escalating. She was the one radiating control. The silence that followed his question stretched just long enough for the audience to feel its weight. It wasn't hesitation. It was ownership of the moment. And in that ownership, the balance of power shifted. Those watching at home felt their own anticipation mount. Was this where she would falter? Would the question unravel her? Social media was already stirring, fingers hovering over keyboards, ready to either praise or pounce depending on her next move. It was the kind of collective breath-holding that only live television could create. Wallace's eyes narrowed, sensing the pause was longer than expected. He was used to quick replies. The defensive scramble that signaled his question had landed, but Crockett gave him no such satisfaction. Instead, her calm exuded something else entirely: deliberation, clarity, the sense that she wasn't reacting on his terms, but preparing to respond on her own. The longer she held her poise, the more the tension grew. Commentators would later describe it as the most uncomfortable silence in that studio in years. For some, it was the silence of someone cornered. For others, it was the silence of someone sharpening their blade. Everyone expected her to stumble, to snap, to fall into the traps Wallace had set with his carefully crafted words. But she didn't. Instead, she paused. And then, the pause stretched like a taut wire. For a moment, it seemed as though the weight of Wallace's question might suffocate the air itself. His smirk lingered, confident, rehearsed. He had delivered this kind of blow 1,000 times before, and he believed the outcome would be the same as always: a stumble, a stutter, a desperate pivot. The cameras zoomed closer, searching for cracks in her composure. The audience leaned forward, waiting for the falter. And then Jasmine Crockett exhaled. It wasn't a sigh of defeat, but the measured release of someone who understood the rhythm of power. She began slowly, her voice calm, even, deliberate. Each word landed with the weight of intention, like stones placed carefully to build a foundation. "Chris," she said, her tone not sharp but steady, "I know what you're trying to do, but let me tell you what's really going on here." The smirk on Wallace's face faltered, just slightly at first. His eyes narrowed, recalibrating. He wasn't prepared for calm dissection. He was prepared for defensiveness, for outrage, for noise. But Crockett gave him none of that. Instead, she unraveled his question piece by piece, exposing its assumptions, dismantling its framing, revealing the bias woven into it as though she were peeling back the layers of a carefully wrapped gift. The audience in the studio fell into an unnatural stillness. It was as if the usual script of political sparring had been torn in half. Crockett wasn't sparring. She was teaching. And with each phrase, each measured pause, she tightened the net around Wallace until there was nowhere left for him to go. Her words didn't race. They flowed. She pointed out how his framing ignored the lived realities of the people she represented. She noted how his so-called neutral question carried the weight of assumptions that were anything but neutral. She reminded him, without raising her voice, that integrity is not measured by how loudly one can interrupt, but by whether one speaks truth even when it is uncomfortable. Wallace shifted in his chair, the confidence that had carried him into the exchange slipping by degrees. The smirk softened, then disappeared entirely. His lips pressed together. His eyes darted, searching for an angle, a thread to pull, a way to regain his grip on the moment. But the moment was gone. Crockett had seized it, and there was no retrieving it. She closed her statement with a line that cut clean through the noise. "You can push me as hard as you want," she said, her voice unwavering, "but you will not push me off the truth." The silence that followed was unlike the silence from before. This was not suspense. It was impact. It was the stunned quiet of an audience watching the unexpected, the undeniable. The studio, which had moments earlier carried the hum of tension, now held something closer to reverence. It was as though everyone present understood they had just witnessed a turning point, a reversal of power so absolute that it could never be walked back. Wallace's face told the story better than any commentator could. His features, once animated, with the confidence of control, now rested in stillness. For a man who had built his brand on unshakable composure, the slip was glaring. And yet, it wasn't dramatic outburst that had undone him. It was Crockett's refusal to play the role he had scripted for her. Political historians would later compare the moment to other legendary mic drops in American debate culture. Lloyd Benson's famous "You're no Jack Kennedy" retort, or Barack Obama's measured takedowns during his presidential debates. But what set Crockett apart was that she didn't rely on wit or spectacle. Her mic drop was built on calm clarity, on refusing to be dragged into the swamp of provocation. She didn't seek to humiliate, she sought to illuminate. And in doing so, she left no escape for Wallace. The ripple of reaction began almost instantly. In the control room, producers glanced at one another, aware they had just captured gold. The clip would be replayed endlessly, dissected from every angle. The silence, the smirk dissolving, the composure unbroken. It was the kind of imagery that transcended politics and entered the realm of cultural memory. And yet, in the moment itself, Crockett's demeanor remained unchanged. She didn't bask in the takedown, didn't gloat, didn't smile for the cameras. She sat steady, the embodiment of what she had always preached. That dignity is not something to be handed out by gatekeepers, but something to be claimed, owned, lived. Her composure was the victory. For Wallace, there was no easy exit. He cleared his throat, attempted a follow-up, but the damage had been done. The audience wasn't listening for his recovery. They were still replaying her words in their minds, savouring the contrast between provocation and poise. He had pushed, but his push had met the immovable, and the immovable had won. In living rooms across America, people felt it too. Some cheered out loud, others shook their heads in disbelief. Social media erupted, with users clipping and sharing the exchange before the broadcast had even ended. Hashtags began to climb, memes took shape, commentators drafted hot takes. A moment born in silence was roaring into virality. But outside that studio, the ripple effect was only beginning. The moment the segment ended, the reaction machine began to hum. Within minutes, the clip was clipped, captioned, and circulating across every major social platform. What had been a pause in the studio became a roar online. Hashtags like Jun's Crockett Calm and Zom's Silent Mic Drop began climbing within the hour, trending, not just regionally, But nationwide, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram lit up with users replaying the silence, zooming in on Wallace's fading smirk, and praising Crockett's unflinching poise. "Dignity beats arrogance every time," one user wrote as their post collected thousands of retweets. Another shared the moment with the caption, "When silence speaks louder than all the noise." Memes multiplied, some putting Crockett's still frame next to historical leaders known for restraint under fire. Others contrasting Wallace's frown with captions that read simply, "Game over." Supporters of Crockett felt vindicated. For them, this was not just about a single exchange, it was proof of what they had long believed. That she was not only ready for the spotlight, but destined to thrive in it. In communities that rarely saw themselves reflected with dignity on national television, her calm felt personal. Immigrant families, women of color, young activists, messages poured in declaring how much her composure meant to them. "She carried all of us in that silence," one comment read, echoed thousands of times in replies and shares. Meanwhile, Wallace found himself on the receiving end of criticism that cut deeper than he had anticipated. Commentators who once praised his sharpness began questioning whether his old style had finally met its limit. "Wallace pushed too hard," one headline read. And Crockett didn't just survive, she exposed the push itself. Even longtime viewers noted the imbalance, the smirk, the loaded phrasing, the condescension that once passed as toughness now looked brittle, out of step with the moment. Cable panels filled their hours dissecting the exchange from every angle. Some argued Crockett's calm was a masterclass in composure. Others debated whether Wallace had underestimated her, or whether his brand of questioning had simply aged poorly in a world craving authenticity. Political strategists played the clip repeatedly, pointing out how Crockett's body language, upright, steady, calm, contrasted with Wallace's increasingly restless demeanor. For once, the punditry did not belong to the interviewer. It belonged to the interviewee. Even celebrities and public figures joined in. Actors, athletes, and musicians shared the clip with words like, "This is how you handle pressure," and "Power in restraint." The viral momentum made its way into late-night comedy monologues, where Wallace's fading smirk became the punchline, and Crockett's silence was celebrated as the jokes set up and pay off all at once. But the most striking part of the aftermath wasn't just the noise, it was the resonance. The moment had pierced through the usual partisan filters. People who didn't follow politics found themselves watching, rewatching, and commenting. Students discussed it in classrooms, community leaders shared it in church gatherings, and families texted it across group chats. It wasn't just about policy, it was about presence, about the universal recognition of grace under fire. Wallace, for his part, attempted to move on, returning to his familiar rhythm of interviews, but the shadow of that silence lingered. Wherever he went, questions followed. Had he miscalculated? Had his signature approach finally been bested? The man who built his career on controlling the narrative found himself caught inside one he couldn't quite rewrite, and through it all, Crockett remained consistent. She didn't gloat, didn't claim victory, didn't milk the moment for sound bites. When asked about it later, she simply said, "I answered with the truth. That's all there was to it." That refusal to make it about herself only deepened the impact. The silence spoke, and she let it keep speaking. The shockwaves rippled further than anyone expected. Supporters felt emboldened, critics scrambled to recalibrate, and the clip cemented itself as one of the defining political media moments of the year. And yet, beyond the viral buzz, there was a deeper lesson. In the end, what lingered was not the question Chris Wallace asked, nor the theatrics of the studio lights. What endured was the silence, the pause after Jasmine Crockett's answer, that carried more force than any shouting match could have. It was in that stillness that a truth revealed itself. Dignity will always outshine provocation. Wallace had brought every ounce of his seasoned bravado to the table. He pressed, he prodded, he tried to corner. But Crockett met him not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with a calm so deliberate it dismantled the very game being played. Her silence reminded America that composure is not weakness, it is power. And in a culture addicted to conflict, that power stood out like lightning against a darkened sky. The moment transcended politics. For women who have so often been told to stay in their place, Crockett's calm was an act of defiance wrapped in grace. For minorities who know what it means to be spoken over, dismissed, or stereotyped, her poise became a mirror of possibility, proof that one can face provocation without surrendering dignity. For every truth-teller who has ever felt small against the weight of cynicism, her answer was a reminder. Silence, when held with confidence, can thunder louder than any insult. It was never just about Crockett versus Wallace. It was about two visions of America colliding under the lights. One vision, rooted in old hierarchies and the comfort of provocation. The other, born of resilience, authenticity, and the quiet strength of those who have fought to belong. And on that night, the latter prevailed. Her response offered a lesson that stretched far beyond politics. Courage is not always loud. Composure is not passive. Americanness is not measured by who shouts the hardest, but by who embodies the values. We claim to cherish fairness, integrity, and respect. Crockett's calm embodied all of these at once, and in doing so, reminded a fractured country of something it too often forgets: that the truest form of strength is often the quietest. Commentators would try to explain it, strategists would try to dissect it, and critics would try to diminish it. But no amount of spin could erase the image etched into the public imagination. Chris Wallace leaning in with a smirk, and Jasmine Crockett answering with a composure so complete it froze the room. That image told a story America needed to hear. That dignity, when wielded with confidence, can silence arrogance without saying a word. Her silence spoke louder than any insult. And in that silence, America heard the echo of something rare and beautiful, the sound of truth standing tall. But even as the moment cemented itself in history, the story was not over. Because for millions who watched, admired, and shared, the question remained: what would they do with the inspiration she sparked? Chris Wallace pushed. Jasmine Crockett answered. And America will never forget the silence that followed. In that single moment, a smirk turned into stillness, and arrogance met the one force it could not overcome: dignity. What we witnessed was more than just television. It was a reminder of what is possible when leaders refuse to bow to provocation and instead embody composure, clarity, and courage. Crockett's calm wasn't just a personal victory, it was a universal statement. It told women, minorities, and truth-tellers everywhere that even in the harshest spotlight, authenticity can prevail. It told America that in the battle between noise and truth, the quiet strength of dignity will always echo louder. But here's the thing: this can't just remain a clip we replay. It has to become a movement we carry forward. Because when truth speaks calmly, even arrogance has no reply. And that lesson, of power without rage, of silence louder than noise, is one we must spread far and wide. So if this moment moved you, if you saw in Jasmine Crockett a reflection of the courage we all need in these divided times, then don't just watch. Act. Share this story. Add your voice. Be part of the movement that says, dignity belongs at the center of our politics and our lives. subscribe, stay connected, and help us build a community of truth tellers who refuse to be drowned out by arrogance. Because one moment of calm courage on live television can inspire millions, but only if we carry it forward together. The lights may have dimmed in that studio, but the silence Crockett created still speaks. And it's calling us to listen, to share, and to rise.